This was the beginning of one of the darkest and most scandalous criminal cases of the second half of the 19th century. Today we are traveling to the United States of America, to the small town of Derby, Connecticut. When Horatio Sherman returned home after a week-long drinking binge in May of 1871, he felt seriously unwell. His wife, Lydia, was not particularly concerned. Her husband often disappeared on such sprees and always fell ill afterward. Just one of his usual ailments, she said, and began giving him brandy, as she routinely did in such cases. The family physician, Dr. Beardsley, had treated Mr. Sherman many times before for the after-effects of heavy drinking, but this time something troubled him. The symptoms were different. Horatio's condition worsened rapidly, and 2 days later, he was dead. Dr. Beardsley insisted on an autopsy. A large amount of arsenic was found in the deceased man's stomach. What followed was an investigation that uncovered truly astonishing facts. It emerged that Lydia Sherman had been married twice before Horatio, and both of her previous husbands had also died under strange circumstances. There were no children left in her family. None biological, none adopted. Forensic examinations established the same cause of death, arsenic. 10 people, possibly more. Over the course of 7 years, from 1864 to 1871, newspapers dubbed her the Connecticut arch-murderess, a modern Borgia, and the poison fiend. Yet until her arrest, neighbors considered Mrs. Sherman a pleasant, respectable woman who was simply terribly unlucky, as death seemed to follow her family wherever she went. How was this even possible? How could a middle-aged woman, neat, devout, and church-going, remain unquestioned for so many years? Let us go back to the beginning, to Christmas of 1824, when a baby girl was born in Burlington, New Jersey. Her name was Lydia Danbury. Lydia Danbury was born on Christmas Eve of 1824 in Burlington, New Jersey. Her life began with tragedy. When she was only 9 months old, her mother died. Her father soon remarried, and young Lydia was sent to live on her uncle's farm. Nothing in her childhood foreshadowed what was to come. She was an ordinary girl, raised in an ordinary family. She lived on her uncle's farm until the age of 16, helping with chores and learning how to manage a household. At 16, she moved to the city of New Brunswick to live with her brother. There, Lydia found work as a seamstress. She was neat, diligent, and skilled with a needle. She also became a member of the local Methodist Church. At the time, this was essential for any young woman who wished to be considered respectable. Contemporaries described the young Lydia as an attractive woman with striking blue eyes. Gentlemen noticed her, and she was well aware of it. It was at church that she first met Edward Struck. He was around 30 years old and worked as a blacksmith. Edward was a widower with 4 children from his first marriage. The age difference was noticeable, but by the standards of the era, it was entirely acceptable. A young woman marrying an established man who could provide for a family was the norm. They married when Lydia was about 20 years old and moved to New York City. New York was changing rapidly in those years. In 1845, the city established a metropolitan police force to replace the old system of night watchmen. The population was growing, the city expanding, and the old system could no longer cope. Edward Struck was offered a position as a police officer. It was a solid job with a steady income. The family moved to Harlem, to 125th Street. Lydia gave birth to 7 children, 4 daughters and 3 sons. The first, Josephine, died in infancy in 1843. Such tragedies were common at the time. Infant mortality was high, and few were surprised when babies failed to survive. The remaining 6 children grew up. The family lived comfortably. Edward had stable work, Lydia ran the household and raised the children. Neighbors considered the Strucks an ordinary, respectable family. But everything changed in a single moment. Edward Struck worked as a police officer in New York City, and at first, life went well. The family lived in Harlem, the children were growing up, and there was enough money to get by. Lydia managed the household, while Edward went to work every day as expected. New York at the time was rapidly turning into a true metropolis. Its population was approaching 1 million. The city was expanding at an astonishing pace. New buildings went up, factories opened, and immigrants arrived from all across Europe. Along with this growth came rising crime. The police were needed more than ever. Edward Struck was an ordinary patrolman, simply doing his job. But one day, he was dispatched to an incident at a hotel ballroom. Edward arrived too late. By the time he got there, a murder had already been committed. A New York detective lay dead. Rumors began to circulate. People whispered that Struck had deliberately delayed his response, that he was afraid for his own life and chose not to rush to the hotel. Whether this was true or not remains unknown. But rumors have a way of shaping reality. An internal investigation was launched, and Edward was dismissed from the police force. For him, this was a catastrophe. He sank into a deep depression. A middle-aged man with a large family, 6 children of his own, and 4 more from his first marriage, had lost both his job and his reputation. Instead of looking for new work, he simply stayed at home. He spent most of his time in bed, doing nothing. Edward's condition continued to deteriorate. His former superior, a police captain, even advised Lydia to have her husband committed to a medical institution. Another officer, a sergeant who lived in the same building, said that Struck had lost his mind and would never recover. At the same time, New York was being ravaged by epidemics. Cholera, typhus, typhoid fever, dysentery, all of them claimed hundreds of lives. Typhus, in particular, tore through poor neighborhoods, becoming almost a permanent epidemic. Smallpox and scarlet fever flared up again and again. Tuberculosis killed more people every year, especially in overcrowded tenement buildings, where families lived packed into small rooms without proper ventilation. Death was everywhere. People died every day. Entire families perished. Doctors often could not even say with certainty what had killed a patient. The symptoms of many diseases were similar. In such an environment, the death of a depressed, middle-aged man raised little suspicion. Edward Struck died. A doctor certified the death, wrote something in the records, and that was the end of it. Lydia was left a widow with 6 children to support. After Edward's death, Lydia was alone with 6 children. She had no money and no steady work. A widow with so many mouths to feed had little chance of finding a decent position. She had to survive somehow. Then new misfortunes began. Lydia's 3 youngest children, 6-year-old Martha Ann, 4-year-old Edward, and 1-year-old William, fell ill shortly after their father's death. The doctor diagnosed gastric fever. In New York at the time, this was common. Children fell ill and died constantly. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, filth, overcrowded housing. No one was particularly shocked when several children in one family were buried in quick succession. All 3 died, one after another. 3 older children remained. They were old enough to work and help their mother. The eldest daughter, also named Lydia, was 18. She found work as a sales clerk in a notion shop in Harlem. 14-year-old George began training as a house painter. The youngest, 12-year-old Anne Eliza, would soon be old enough to look for work as well. But George did not last long. He fell ill with what the doctor called painter's colic. At the time, paint was made with lead. It made coatings more durable and long-lasting, protected them from moisture and corrosion. Painters constantly inhaled the fumes, and lead entered their bodies. Lead poisoning was a known occupational disease. George was bedridden. He suffered for several days and then died in the winter of 1864. The doctor wrote painter's colic on the death certificate. It seemed perfectly logical. The boy worked with paint and was poisoned by lead. That same winter, the youngest daughter, Anne Eliza, also fell ill. She developed a fever. Her older sister Lydia even quit her job at the shop to stay home and care for her. It did not help. Eliza died as well. Of Lydia Struck's 7 children, only one remained, 18-year-old Lydia, named after her mother. She began sewing hats at home, trying to earn at least some money. Soon, she too fell ill, and she died. All 7 children, 6 of them within just a few months. Neighbors pitied Mrs. Struck. Poor woman, how much grief she had endured. She had lost her husband and all her children. People came to offer condolences and helped however they could. But one person asked a question. Lydia's stepson, Cornelius Struck, Edward's son from his first marriage, went to the police. He asked how it was possible that all 7 children his father had with Lydia were dead, and 6 of them almost at the same time, within just a few months. While Lydia herself never fell ill and appeared perfectly healthy. The police promised to look into it, but they did not look very hard. Death in New York in those years was an everyday occurrence. Tuberculosis and typhus wiped out entire families. Children died frequently, especially in poor households. And Mrs. Struck was a respectable, upstanding woman. She worked as a nurse for a local doctor, a perfectly appropriate position for a widow. How could such a woman be suspected of anything sinister? Cornelia Struck's suspicions were dismissed. Lydia was working at a sewing workshop when one of the clients, Mr. John Curtis, happened to learn that she had once worked as a nurse. He immediately offered her a position. His elderly mother was in need of a caregiver. For Lydia, this was an excellent opportunity. Nursing paid better than sewing, and she would be able to live in the house of the elderly woman in Stratford, Connecticut. An elegant home, a respectable family, stability. Lydia moved to Stratford and began caring for Mr. Curtis's mother. Everything went smoothly, but after 8 months, she received another offer. A wealthy widower, Mr. Dennis Hurlburt, was looking for a housekeeper. Lydia accepted and went to work for him. Dennis Hurlburt was an elderly man, much older than Lydia. He lived alone in a large house and needed a woman to run the household. Lydia managed perfectly. The house was spotless. Meals were always prepared. Everything was neat and orderly. Only a few days passed before the old man proposed to her. "Marry me," he said. Lydia accepted. She was already over 40, a widow with no secure means of support. Hurlburt, on the other hand, was a well-off man with a fine home. For a woman in her position, it was an excellent match. They married. The residents of Stratford and of Fairfield County regarded the new Mrs. Hurlburt as a model wife. She was attentive and caring, devoted to her elderly husband. Neighbors saw her attending church, dressing modestly, and behaving properly in society. They lived together for 14 months. Then Dennis Hurlburt fell ill and died. In September of 1870, Lydia became the heir to his entire estate, a house valued at roughly $20,000, plus $10,000 in cash. For that era, it was an enormous sum. Lydia Hurlburt became a wealthy widow. She could have lived comfortably on that money and never worked another day in her life. But a few months later, a man approached her. Mr. Horatio Nelson Sherman was a mechanic with an excellent reputation. Recently, however, he had run into serious financial trouble. He was a widower with 4 children: 17-year-old Nelson, 15-year-old Ada, 4-year-old Nathaniel, and an infant named Frankie, not yet a year old. Horatio had been born in the same year as Lydia, on February 19th, 1824. They were the same age. He asked her to marry him. Lydia did not agree immediately, but she liked Horatio and even offered to help him sort out his debts. In the end, they married. Lydia moved into his home in the small town of Derby, Connecticut, about 8 miles from New Haven. Also living with the family was the mother of Horatio's first wife, Mary, who remained in the house to help care for little Frankie. Soon after Lydia became the new Mrs. Sherman, the infant Frankie fell ill. A doctor came and examined the child, but nothing helped. The baby died. This meant that the grandmother, the mother of Mr. Sherman's first wife, no longer needed to stay in the house. With no one left to care for, she packed her belongings and left. 15-year-old Ada, Horatio's daughter, was a beautiful girl. Neighbors often remarked on it. She was pretty, well-mannered, modest. Young men in the area noticed her when she went to church or took walks. She seemed to have her whole life ahead of her. But Ada, too, fell ill. No one could understand what was wrong with her. The symptoms were unclear, and doctors were baffled. Her condition worsened, and soon she died. Within just a few months, Horatio Sherman had lost 2 children, and not long before that, he had lost his wife. Too many deaths in too short a time. It broke him. Horatio began to drink. At first, just a little, to dull the pain. Then more and more. He would leave home for days at a time and return completely drunk. All the money Lydia gave him went to alcohol. Lydia tried to fight it. She pleaded with her husband, reasoned with him, begged him to stop. Eventually, she managed to persuade him to seek help. At that time, the temperance movement was gaining strength in America. People formed societies to combat alcohol consumption, believing that drink destroyed families and ruined lives, and they called for total abstinence. Horatio agreed to join such a temperance society. He took a solemn pledge never to drink again. For several weeks, he kept his word. He did not touch alcohol, came home sober, and even began working again. Lydia hoped the worst was over. Then Horatio sold their piano for $300 and went on a binge. He was gone for an entire week. When he returned home, he was in terrible condition. Drunk, sick, barely able to stand. Lydia, as usual, began giving him brandy. That was what she always did after his binges, to ease his hangovers. But this time, Horatio grew steadily worse. He vomited violently and could hardly get out of bed. Lydia sent for Dr. Beardsley. The doctor examined the patient. Horatio told him, "It's probably just one of my usual illnesses." He had fallen ill after drinking many times before and assumed this was the same. But Dr. Beardsley was an experienced physician. He had treated Horatio Sherman before and knew what ordinary alcohol poisoning looked like. This time, the symptoms were entirely different. Something was wrong. The next day, Horatio Sherman died. Dr. Beardsley insisted on an autopsy. He sent the deceased man's stomach for chemical analysis to Professor George Frederick Barker of Yale University. The analysis took several weeks. The results showed a large quantity of arsenic in the body. Horatio's friends and relatives demanded that the bodies of Frankie and Ada be exhumed. The authorities agreed.
Autopsies were performed on both children. Arsenic was found in their bodies as well.
Then another body was examined. Lydia's second husband, Dennis Hurlburt, was exhumed from his grave in Stratford. Once again, arsenic. On June 7, 1871, Lydia was visiting relatives in New Brunswick when the police arrived and arrested her. The charge was murder. She was taken to New Haven and placed in jail to await trial. The trial began on April 16, 1872, and it was an event that extended far beyond the borders of Connecticut. The entire country followed the case. Journalists arrived in droves, and the courtroom was packed. People wanted to see with their own eyes the woman the newspapers had dubbed the Poison Fiend, the Connecticut arch-murderess, and a modern Borgia. But when Lydia appeared in court, many were disappointed. She looked utterly ordinary. No demon, no monster. Just a middle-aged woman, neatly dressed. She wore a black alpaca dress, a black and white shawl, a straw hat, and silk gloves. Her face was partially hidden behind a thin black veil. She looked like the very image of a respectable Victorian lady, proper, prim, and irreproachable. Lydia was 47 years old. She behaved calmly, almost indifferently. Some reporters even wrote that behind the veil she appeared nearly cheerful, as if she had come not to a murder trial, but to a social event. She was tried only for the murder of Horatio Nelson Sherman, her third husband. Although autopsies had shown that Dennis Hurlburt and two of Horatio's children had also been poisoned with arsenic, prosecutors chose not to charge her in those cases. One charge, they decided, was sufficient. When the judge asked for her plea, Lydia answered clearly and firmly, "Not guilty." The trial lasted 8 days. Newspapers published detailed reports every day. Again and again, reporters returned to the same theme: how utterly ordinary the defendant looked. The public expected a monster and saw an aging woman in a plain black dress. The defense argued that Horatio Sherman might have ingested arsenic accidentally, or that he may have taken his own life. He had been deeply depressed after the deaths of his wife and 2 children, burdened by financial problems and alcoholism. Perhaps he had chosen to end it all himself. Lydia maintained her innocence. She wanted to testify, to take the stand and tell her version of events. Her lawyer, however, categorically forbade it. The prosecution presented its evidence. The autopsy had clearly revealed arsenic in the victim's stomach, in significant quantities. Experts testified. Witnesses described the final days of Horatio's life, but there was no direct proof that Lydia herself had administered the poison. The case rested entirely on circumstantial evidence. No one had seen her mix arsenic into his food or drink. No one could say with certainty when or where she had purchased it for that specific occasion. From a legal standpoint, there were grounds for reasonable doubt. Nevertheless, the jury deliberated and returned with a verdict: guilty of murder in the second degree. Not first degree, which would have implied premeditation. Second degree, killing without prior intent, committed in the heat of the moment. Some newspapers wrote that the jury had deliberately chosen the lesser charge. A conviction for first-degree murder would have meant the death penalty, and the jurors, all men, were unwilling to send a woman to the gallows, even if they believed her guilty. Lydia Sherman was sentenced to life imprisonment at Wethersfield Prison in Connecticut. While Lydia awaited transfer to prison, something unexpected happened. The prison warden, Mr. Weber, suggested that she write a book, a confession in which she would tell her version of events. Lydia agreed. She dictated the text. She could barely read or write, struggled to remember exact dates and names, but she told her story. In this book, she confessed. She admitted to poisoning her first husband, Edward Struck. She confessed to poisoning 6 of her children, all except her firstborn, Josephine, who had died of natural causes in infancy in 1843. She admitted to poisoning her second husband, Dennis Hurlburt. She confessed to poisoning 2 children of her third husband, the infant Frankie and 15-year-old Ada. But when it came to her third husband, Horatio Sherman, she insisted it was not her. Yes, there was arsenic in the house, but she had not given it to him. Perhaps Horatio had swallowed it accidentally. In those days, households often kept various powders and compounds. There was a substance called saleratus, similar to baking soda, which produced foam when mixed with cider. Perhaps Horatio had mistaken it for arsenic. The irony was striking. The only murder she denied committing was the very one for which she was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. In the book, Lydia also revealed a curious detail about her first murder. She claimed that the idea of poisoning Edward Struck had been suggested to her by a police sergeant who lived nearby. He told her that her husband was insane and would never recover. He advised her to remove him from the way. More than that, he allegedly told her where to buy arsenic and in what quantities it should be administered. Whether this was true or not remains unknown, but if it was, then the idea of using poison may not have originated with Lydia herself. The book was titled Life, Crimes, and Conviction of Lydia Sherman, The Poison Fiend. It was published in 1873 and became a bestseller. Across America, people read the confession of the woman poisoner. Lydia was sent to Wethersfield Prison, but she did not remain there long. In June 1877, 5 years after her sentencing, she escaped. The method was surprisingly clever. Lydia repeatedly pretended to faint. She complained of poor health, insisted that she was very ill. Prison officials later admitted that a female guard had been careless and insufficiently attentive. Lydia somehow obtained a white dress to replace her prison uniform. One day, she simply walked out of her cell and passed through the prison gates. Friends were waiting outside. They took her to Providence, Rhode Island, one of the oldest cities in the United States. The escape made headlines immediately. Lydia Sherman's story was far too famous to go unnoticed. She checked into a hotel, calling herself Mrs. Brown from Philadelphia. Later, while speaking with the hotel owner's wife, Mrs. Sears, she introduced herself as Mrs. Moore. Mrs. Sears grew suspicious. The woman changed names and behaved oddly. She contacted the police. Lydia was arrested once again and returned to Wethersfield Prison. The book was reissued in 1878, as public interest surged following the escape. That same year, on May 16, 1878, Lydia Sherman died in prison. She was 53 years old. The official cause of death was listed as illness, though the exact details remain unknown. How many people died at her hands? Officially, she confessed to 11 murders, 3 husbands and 8 children. But many historians believe the true number of victims may have been higher, perhaps far higher.
The case of Lydia Sherman became one of the most infamous in 19th-century American criminal history. Books and articles were written about her. Her name became a byword, a modern Borgia, the poison fiend. These nicknames followed her into history. What drove this woman? Greed? Fear of poverty? A desire to rid herself of burdens? Or something else entirely? Something we will never know? There are no answers to those questions, only facts and a long list of the dead who surrounded her. Thank you very much for being with me today. I hope you found this story compelling. I look forward to your comments and feedback, and I'll see you in the next episode.